Olly, good morning. Good to speak with you. Now, unfortunately, this whole incident has led to a further collapse of the Iranian nuclear deal.
That's right. The Iranians are saying that there are various ways in which they are not going to live up to the conditions of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Now, we knew that that nuclear deal was in peril anyway because the Americans had pulled out of it, Donald Trump calling it the worst deal in history. But the Europeans and the Iranians had been working to try and keep the deal alive, and this crisis has really dealt it another blow. Now, it's not completely dead yet. There are glimmers of life in that 2015 Iran nuclear deal, but clearly Tehran is using it as leverage to try and persuade the Europeans not to side completely with the Americans in this latest crisis. The Iran nuclear deal was designed to keep the Iranians from developing a nuclear weapon in exchange for the ability to do business in some international markets and keep its own economy ticking over. So that is one central area now that European powers are focused on. They are calling on the Iranians not to go too far in moving away from that deal, which really does look very much in peril now.
So what's been the response from the UK government? We know the Prime Minister is said to meet with ministers to discuss the crisis at some point today.
That's right, and the British have not been overtly criticising the Americans for the killing of General Soleimani in Iraq, but at the same time the British Prime Minister and the British Foreign Secretary have been calling for restraint from both sides when it comes to this deepening crisis, and they are insisting that they will try and work to de-escalate the situation. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking to Donald Trump on Sunday, but also speaking to Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, and Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and those European leaders issuing a joint statement as well. Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel also calling for there to be restraint and for there to be no further escalations of this crisis. It's an interesting position for the British to be in diplomatically. Clearly this all comes as the UK leaves the European Union. It is working out its place in the world. There's been lots of speculation that the British will have to side more closely with the Americans when it comes to foreign policy as a result of that exit from the EU. But in this episode, I think Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, is trying to straddle the gaps between the Americans and the Europeans and perhaps try and see the British work as a broker to try and work out this crisis without any further escalations. Add into the mix the fact that, of course, Britain has 400 troops in Iraq at the moment, which Iraqi MPs have effectively voted to expel from the country. Now, that doesn't mean that British troops are going to be immediately thrown out, and certainly London is working, discussing with Baghdad the options now and insisting that British troops are playing an important role as part of the coalition that is in Iraq, making sure that the Islamic State group can't return and gain a stronghold, a foothold in the country.
Now, Olly, would you say that, Iran has scored a bit of a coup here because of that decision, or the fact that the Iraqi parliament has voted to kick out the U.S. troops out of Iraq? And that could also leave a bit of a vacuum for ISIS to replenish itself.
Yeah, that's right. You also have to remember that the Iranians have been helping the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq anyway, but certainly this episode does appear to be strengthening Iranian influence inside Iraq. That will be concerning to the British, to other European powers and to the Americans, but we're now in the pretty extraordinary situation of US President Donald Trump threatening sanctions against Iraq if Iraq does go ahead and throw American servicemen and women out of the country. The Americans have 5,000 or so troops in Iraq and a major military presence, major military bases inside the country, and Donald Trump saying, look, if you throw us out now, we will put sanctions down on the Iraqi economy, which are perhaps worse than those we already have in place on Iran. That's a pretty extraordinary situation for us to find ourselves in, given the American-led invasion of Iraq and the military presence that we have seen there basically really ever since. The British will be trying to diffuse that situation somewhat, trying to bring tensions down between Washington and Baghdad as well. So another example of how Britain can try, at least, whether it will have any effect remains to be seen, to be some kind of broker, a go-between in these various mini-crises developing.
And lastly, Olly, this will be a big test for the relationship between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump.
Very much so, and you know, we have seen how Boris Johnson has tried to, since he's been Prime Minister and even since the UK general election, insist that the relationship with America is what is important here. It's not so much about individual relationships. He doesn't want to be seen to be too close to US President Donald Trump, but at the moment he knows that he can't have an effective relationship with Washington without maintaining that personal link with Donald Trump. So a very difficult balance for Boris Johnson to strike here. He knows that there is danger in either direction. It'll be very interesting indeed to see whether he can exert any influence on his American colleague.
Thank you so much. That's our UK correspondent, Olly Barratt, giving us his take and the take of the British Parliament. And the UK PM is set to meet with ministers to discuss the crisis a little bit later on today.